The Other Side Podcast, Episode 7. All right, welcome to The Other Side, a late night edition. Finally getting some time to sit down at the computer and go through some things. From the last time I recorded, I had mentioned that I was in the process of moving, and so we finally have gotten that complete, and we are settled into our new home now. And so excited to start that process. But that has consumed quite a bit of time over the last couple of weeks. So glad to be back behind the computer and ready to go. So when I last left you guys, we were talking about sovereignty and legitimacy. And we had started to kind of go through and talk a little bit about the notion and idea of what a sovereign nation looks like, what is a legitimate government. We started to briefly dive into talking about what happens when governments are deemed illegitimate. And we talked about some examples throughout nations' history and throughout history of the world, of other countries, where the peoples of the country have decided that the government is no longer legitimate and what their recourse has been. And in many instances, it's ended in civil war or revolution. But there are options out there, alternatives to kind of push back against government when we feel like it oversteps its boundaries. And I think that's something that kind of irregardless of what side of the aisle you're on today, whether I talk to Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, whatever it is, my libertarian friends, people are kind of at their wits' end with government, and they kind of just throw their hands up and say, well, what are we going to do about this? And so kind of in that vein and thinking about what it would take to get people to come together, my mind kind of went towards something that was written back during the ratification process of the Constitution. And so again, I know this is something that I've talked about before in the past, but we're going to kind of hit on this in a little bit more detail today than what I've done before in the past. And we're going to take a look at one of the writings of James Madison in the Federalist Papers. And today we're going to be taking a look at one of the more popular writings, which was Federalist number 10. And before we jump into looking at that specifically and addressing what Madison says in Federalist 10, I want to kind of talk about the Federalist Papers as a whole. I think it's important to have an idea and an understanding of what the Federalist Papers are. Now, again, if you have taken a government class before, or if you recall back from however long ago it was that you took government, you may or may not have been introduced to the Federalist Papers. Usually kind of gets mentioned in passing as one of the things that was a precursor to the ratification of the Constitution. And John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison are the three authors of these pamphlets that were compiled later on together into a book. And essentially what these were is, and I think I mentioned this maybe going back to episode 1, it was very early on in the infancy of the podcast where I addressed and talked about what went on in Philadelphia at the convention. And remembering that the initial charge of the framers, of the men that were there, to take a look at the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation was not to create a new government, not to create this constitution that we would end up getting. It was simply just to amend the Articles of Confederation. And so when Madison proposes the Virginia Plan, which essentially was the blueprint for what would be a majority of the Constitution, the way that it gets ratified, it kind of catches some people off guard. And so you kind of have these two camps that get established in Philadelphia. You have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which are kind of misnamed in a way. And I've talked about that before as well, too, in identifying what federalism is. We hear a lot today about the federal government. I refer to that as the general government or the national government, understanding that the definition of what federalism is, divided powers between a national central government and state and local governments. But at any rate, these documents, these pamphlets, were written as propaganda, essentially, to get people to come around to the idea of creating this consolidated central form of government, because many people were skeptical of this. They kind of saw what they had just rebelled from, which was a strong central government, and they said, why would we want this? Why would we want to create a government that would give the people in D.C. the power and authority to do the things that are laid out in the Constitution? And so the Anti-Federalists wrote a series of papers called the Anti-Federalist Papers. So that kind of gives you a little bit of historical background into what the intent was behind these documents. Again, they were propaganda pieces, so we must keep that in mind. And the purpose of this was to drum up support for what Madison, who, from what I understand in the studying that I've done of him, was very put off by this whole process. The entire thing really irked him, and in studying the Constitutional Convention, he oftentimes had people that would speak up on his behalf. He was known as a terrible public speaker, very soft spoken. I think he was all of 5'4", very soft, effeminate voice. And so oftentimes he had people do his heavy hitting for him. There's no doubt he was a genius as far as his writings and whatnot, but he certainly did not stand out among the giants of the Constitutional Convention in terms of speaking up on his own behalf. So a lot of his writings are where you get a glimpse into what he is thinking here. And so when we analyze and look at Federalist number 10, the main topic here that we're looking at, and I really think this is important as we look at where we are today in society. That's where I find fascinating as you look back at history, and I know sometimes history can be dull and dry, but man, when you really look at it and you say, gosh, these guys were talking about issues that still exist today, and to kind of look at what they were saying at the time and to kind of put that into context into what we go through today, I think that's fascinating, and I think this is one of those things that kind of fits that mold. So the key phrase here is factions. That's what essentially, if you're going to boil Federalist number 10 down into one word, Madison is addressing the idea of factions. Now, again, you might say, well, why? Where does that come from? Well, why is he talking about factions? Well, again, we go back to the point and the goal of the Federalists in creating this strong central government, and there are these questions about democracy and a republic, and what will all of these different groups that will undoubtedly emerge in society, how will we deal with these different groups, and so that's kind of where I want to start. And I know this has kind of been picked at a little bit, but you go back and look at what was written in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, it's that all men are created equal thing. And I know that kind of gets picked at a little bit, and people may in passing question it, but I want to challenge you to really think about that statement. And if you haven't really done that before, stop and think about whether or not you agree with that. Just because it's written in the Declaration of Independence and some of these things that are written in the Constitution, state constitution, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's canon. It doesn't mean that it's right. And so I ask you to kind of consider and think about, when you hear all men are created equal, how true do you think that is? Now, I tend to think not so much. I tend to think that's an erroneous statement. I think for what it was intended to communicate, it could be, I understand what they were trying to say, But I think that what we've warped that into has been, very, very misleading into thinking about the fact that people enter into this world with circumstances. Some people are born with the silver spoon. Some people are born into the cycle of poverty and violence, and some people are born with certain abilities and talents. I'm not 6'8". I'm not gifted physically. Whereas some people are, and they can use that to their advantage to be able to do certain things. What I think what we should try to strive for in talking about in terms of this word equality, right? All men are created equal, is to think a little bit more about equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. And I don't want to get off onto a tangent with that today, but that is something that I've discussed before in the past, and I want you to kind of keep in mind here. So that's the first thing is that we've got to start off by thinking about factions and why they exist. And Madison spends some time talking about that in here today. And so the other part that he talks about is, okay, well, because factions are going to exist, and that's essentially what he says. He says that, when you look at factions, there's two things to look at. Number one is the source. Why do factions exist, and what can we do about it? And essentially what he says in the Cliff Notes version is, we can't do anything about it. And he makes this kind of comparison of talking about the reason why factions exist is because there's liberty. And we've talked about that before as well. I gave you the analogy of what I tell my students all the time is you've got safety and security on the one hand, and then you've got liberty and freedom on the other. And if you, by nature, want to increase the liberty and freedom in your country, you are going to decrease the safety and security because people are going to have more free reign and free opportunity to do what they want to do. And so sometimes that might push the boundaries and people might not be as safe and secure. However, if you live in a society where there's a crackdown, whether it be by local police force or just government agencies in general, that might lead to more stability, more security, but by nature, you're going to have less freedom and opportunity. You can put any number of examples into that equation and see how that works there. And so Madison essentially says, okay, the source of factions is liberty, and you can't squash that. That's like air. If you take the air out of a person, then they're going to die. And so he says, well, we can't do that. We can't eliminate liberty. So then the second thing that he talks about with factions is what are the effects of that? And that's really what he focuses in on and studies. And he kind of talks a little bit about the purpose that government serves in analyzing that. And so that's what we're going to take a look at. So what he's arguing here for essentially is, as I mentioned earlier, a large republic to control the effects of factions. Now, it's also very important, and he spends a little bit more time in here defining what a faction is and the impact that it has on society. And that is to talk about what the role of government is in controlling these factions and why there needs to be a larger republic. So just to kind of clarify what he means by faction, he says, I understand a number of citizens, he's saying by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So the first thing I think is very important there is he's saying, like, look, it doesn't matter. We're not talking about majority or minority in terms of numbers. We're just talking about identifying a group of people who have self-interest. And it's as simple as that. Could be the 1%ers in society, certainly a minority in terms of numbers, but a group of people who are actively fighting for policies that make it better for them, whether it's, less taxation or finding loopholes around paying taxes or, being able to shield their money in various different ways and knowing how to use the system to be able to do that. The 99% could squash that, right? And so he talks a little bit about reasons why that can't happen or why it doesn't happen. And we'll get to that here in just a little bit. So I'm going to kind of go through three things that he points out here, and I've already kind of hit on one of them, but we'll kind of go through these in order. First, as I mentioned earlier, he argues for a large republic. He argues for this consolidation, and basically the premise behind this is that he says that when there's more people, there's less of a chance of corruption. And let me just kind of explain what I think he means by that, and I think he kind of lays this out in the writing. Is if you have a large base of people, when the politicians that are running for office have to get a large number of votes to get into office, there's less chance of corruption. You kind of think of it in terms of a larger city versus small town. You think a little bit about, well, there might be corruption in a large city, and certainly that's not to say there can't be. Sometimes when you think about backwoods, small towns, you think of cliques, you think of a small number of families or people who control policies, whether they be on town council, school boards, things of that nature. And so those people can, by nature of the sheer volume of people, or lack thereof in this case, can control processes and become more corrupt. And that's something that I think is really interesting as kind of a quick side note here. And I had this woven into the conversation here, but I want to take a moment to address it right now. And that is what I think Madison really fails to recognize in Federalist number 10 is the innate, the nature of people, just being corrupt in general, regardless of the numbers of people that you serve or the position that you have. But people are self-interested. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I actually think that's a very positive thing, to be self-interested. But irregardless of the size of the people that you serve, you're going to have self-interested people no matter what. And so I think that's a pretty glaring hole that he has in his argument here, irregardless. And again, as I said, you could look at places like New York City, Chicago, LA. There's corruption all over the place. That has little to do with the amount of people and more to do with the people at the heart of the matter there. Number two, he says that larger republics equal larger factions. And so you have more people to create more factions, and you kind of get this splintering effect in society, and then studying the impact that has, where if you have a smaller area, you may have two main competing factions that are going back and forth and going at each other, whereas if you get into a larger city or state, then you may have more factions that will essentially kind of beat each other up. And so then you won't have this dominant group in society that are dictating how things go, much like what we experienced prior to the revolution. And so I gave the example earlier of the one percenters, right? A minority in terms of numbers. And so he kind of talks about, well, why can't the 99 come together? Well, because among that 99%, you have a lot of different opinions, right? You probably have people in the 99 that are willing and ready to go after the one percenters. And whether it be, obviously we've seen physical violence and vandalism and destruction of property, or finding ways to use the political system to shut these guys down, closing loopholes, tax loopholes, and things of that nature. But then you have people that are apathetic. You have people who are in the 99 that say, "Hey, good for the 1%. They're there. They deserve it. They earned it. I have nothing against those people. Their lifestyle doesn't affect me. I'm not interested in mounting any kind of an offensive against those people." And so when you look at majority minority in terms of numbers, I think what Madison is saying here is that a larger republic is going to be better because then you won't have, again, just those two kind of competing factors together, uniting and joining forces and then battling against each other. You'll have all these different splintered groups within society, and he sees that as a good thing. And then finally, just to kind of piggyback off that, he says, without a large republic, we would fracture. We would essentially fall apart. We would be like what we were under the Articles of Confederation, that without a strong centralized body, governmental body overseeing things, we would fracture and fall apart. We would have 50 nations doing their own thing as opposed to one unified nation. Now, again, here I tend to disagree with him. I think that is what we should strive for. I think that's something that we should look after and think, rethink the republic and look at it as, again, these individual states that we have in the United States of America, and look at it from a perspective of what would it look like if each of the 50 states were treated as their own country, if they were able to set their own tax policies, enter into treaties and trade agreements with other nations, utilize their resources the way that they want. I think you would unleash a lot of capability and potential within this country. And then, you have common trade agreements and you have reciprocity among the states where, you still don't lose some of that when you go to a fractured, splintered system. I think that would be a fantastic thing for this country. And that kind of then brings us into wrapping up for today. And that is, and I posted this on my Facebook wall as I was prepping for this today, that, essentially the end of government should be to promote the individuality of us as citizens of this country, not to get us to conform to a common goal or end. And you can take any number of examples today. Doesn't matter what it is: tax policy, education, gay rights, gun control, you name it. What is it that when we look at those individual issues, are we seeing with how they're being dealt? Well, we're seeing the government essentially saying that by the point of the end of the gun, you are going to do A, B, C, X, Y, Z. Use the example of the LGBTQ issue of transgender bathroom access in several different states. And essentially what the federal government said under at least the Obama administration, if you don't comply, you're going to lose federal funding. And so again, when you look at what the role of government is, it should be to promote individuality. I'm not saying that government should favor, pick and choose winners or losers. I'm not saying that it should be squashing the rights of citizens, not by any means. I think that individual states should have the right to pick and choose the types of laws that they want to implement. But certainly under the incorporation doctrine, they're not able to do that. And so, when you look at this, and this kind of, I jotted down a note too here with this, the 21st century push of multiculturalism kind of being crammed down our throats, whether it be through education or through mass culture, mass society in terms of media, things of that nature. Again, I'm not anti-multiculturalism. I'm not necessarily against learning about other cultures, but it's that end goal of what purpose does government serve in promoting that. It's this: you will do it or else, you will conform or else. If there is a group of citizens in this country that want to live their life a certain way, they ought to have the capability or the opportunity to do that. And so there's been a lot of discussion here recently about the state of California wanting to secede. Now it's kind of simmered down a little bit since the election has died down, but there was a mass push in the media to talk about secession. And I'm all for secession. I'm all for a state saying, I no longer agree to the contract of what I signed up for when we ratified this Constitution, and we want to secede from this and become our own country. And I think that state has every right to do that and every right to enforce their own Constitution. And if they want to have laws in about all these different things, and the citizens of that country is essentially what would become our state, say, hey, yeah, we're on board with this, then more power to you. And if the people that are living there say, I'm not so sure about this, well, then they should be free to be able to up and move. And there might be a citizen in the state of Arizona or Utah or Nevada say, hey, I really like what they've got going on over there in California. I think I want to go join that movement. And you let the power of the ideas play out and not some bureaucrat telling you that you're going to have to live this way. I truly believe that if your government, if your society is leading a positive, beneficial lifestyle or creating a positive environment, then it's going to win out, right? If it truly is a beneficial society, then people are going to see that and they're going to want to be a part of it. But when you force people that don't want to do those things into those things, that's where you get this resentment. That's where you start getting government to play this divisiveness card where they get these factions that Madison talks about and they use it to their advantage. They drum up the hate, they drum up the fear, and they use that to motivate you into wanting to think or act or behave a certain way. And that's what I think has happened a lot in our country today, and why we have, unfortunately, issues like what we saw today in Washington, D.C., unfortunately, with the congressman being shot at the baseball practice, where you see just the vitriol and the hate being drummed up on both sides of the aisle. It's not just liberals, it's not just conservatives. It is this move away from thinking in moderation and thinking more on the fringes that really are driving us to where we are today. And so the thing that I want to wrap up with here is, again, when these types of things arise and when people start to talk about the state of the union and where we are, again, you look at government as the savior. And I just say to you, if you're looking in that area, you're looking in the wrong spot. Madison writes a little bit in Federalist 10 about the nature of politicians. He kind of has this little exchange in there where he talks about, well, these guys can't be the judge, jury, and executioner, but they've got to be the kind of the cream of the crop, but they're not always going to be the cream of the crop. So what happens then? And you kind of, in my opinion, see him thinking out loud about this. And I've mentioned this before, guys, that these politicians are not the smartest men and women in the room. They're just not. And that's not taking anything away from them. They're very well educated. They come from various different backgrounds, some of them business, some medical, education. They come from all walks of life. And I applaud them for their effort in sacrificing, because I'm sure it takes a lot to represent in Congress, whether it be at the Senate or House or in the executive branch. But at the same time, though, we can't look to these guys as saviors to the solutions that we need to fix what might be broken in our society today. And so, again, I want to encourage you to think about that as you think about the issues that surround the areas that you live in, whether it be your local county, town, your state. If you're looking to the federal, national government, or even the state government for solutions, it's just you're looking in the wrong area. We've got to think local, act local. We've got to go to our local town councils, school boards, county commissioners, and really get change rooted in that area. Heck, even start at your local neighborhood, in your HOA. I know I've had a lot of discussions with people over the last 6 months about the role of homeowners associations. And just that has a bigger impact on your daily life than anything else. And those are small little steps that you can take to see changes in your daily life. And so again, to kind of wrap this up, as we look at what Madison writes in Federalist 10, I think we can see where he was kind of trying to go with this, but maybe where he ended up falling a little bit short in the understanding of what a larger republic would look like, and ultimately what we have today. And this is going to serve as a springboard for what I'm going to talk about next time in episode 8, where I talk about the issue of what an ideal republic would look like, what the size and nature of it would look like, the number of people, the number of representatives. I know I talked about that in the previous episode, but I just really thought as I was prepping for that, I came across this. I want to do a full episode on Federalist 10 and talk a little bit about that before I jump into this article on the ideal republic. So that'll be our discussion next time. As always, we say that your education is not complete until you've heard the other side.